Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. It's been a while since the island of Cuba claimed center stage in the news. Some of you may remember the Mariel boat lift in 1980, when thousands of Cuban refugees fled the island in makeshift boats, trying to make it to Florida and what they thought would be a better life. The controversy over whether 6-year-old Elian Gonzalez was a refugee or a hostage of the U.S. government, and the brief thaw in diplomatic and cultural relations under President Barack Obama. Now, Cuba's in the news again, with President Trump restoring stiff economic sanctions and pondering out loud whether to take control of Cuba the way he did Venezuela. What's been happening in Cuba in the intervening years? How are Cubans faring today? And what does their future look like? Here to discuss this is Katrin Hansing, a professor of anthropology at Baruch College and a longtime student of Cuban history and politics. Welcome. So what do you think, what's your reaction to Donald Trump's recent aggressive comments about taking over Cuba?
Yeah, Cuba seems to be next on the agenda. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure for me to be here. You know, like most of us who study, who observe, who work on Cuba, this current phase in complex U.S.-Cuban relations is partly, on the one hand, kind of more of the same, but also a more aggressive tone has been taken, and we're all kind of just waiting to see what happens. You know, the situation is in limbo, and it could go in so many different directions. And so professionally, it's both interesting, but also as a human being, I feel, I fear for Cuba and Cubans, to be honest.
Why would Trump want to take over Cuba, and why would the United States want to take over Cuba? It could be two separate things.
Yeah, well, the two countries have had a very complex relationship for a very, very long time. Kind of almost a sort of a love-hate relationship, if you want. And I think because Cuba, for the last 60 plus years, since the Cuban Revolution, has, particularly for the American government, kind of been this almost forbidden fruit, right? I mean, they've gone politically in such a different direction in the US's backyard, choosing a socialist, communist path. That for the American government as a whole, there has been always this want to sort of change Cuba, as many presidents have tried in different manners. And I think this administration too sees that as almost, the icing on the cake, if you want, in terms of their political achievements. So I think it's really, in part, motivated by something that hasn't been able to be achieved so far in this long history between the US and Cuba. But I think also President Trump in this moment has been feeling very empowered by his success in Venezuela. That went very well, that operation. In terms of the military operation, at least. And I think that was largely what motivated him to then go into Iran and keep on saying that Cuba is next, right? And so in this time, we're kind of waiting to see what happens, whether the US will really go in militarily or just squeeze it more economically, which it's been doing since January, and have it just fall apart by itself. So there are a couple of options on the table, and we will see what happens.
But I mean, why have we kept up the embargo for so long? I mean, back in, I guess, 59, 60, 61, Cuba was seen as a sort of maybe a satellite of the Soviet Union, and was going to use its proximity to us to threaten us. And but the Soviet Union fell apart, I guess, in 91 or so. But the tension has continued, the aggressiveness has continued.
Well, I think the main reason why the situation and the relationship is so antagonistic since the early 60s to now is because Cuba chose a different path and has maintained that path. Or let's say the Cuban government has chosen a different path, which is a different political path. And to have that in the US's backyard is like a thorn in the eye.
It's sort of like you bet on the wrong horse. So
yes, and here you have a small island, right next to the US, that has had the audacity, if you want, to do something that very few other nations have done.
Yeah.
And I think that if you want audacity and arrogance almost, and they've been able to keep on going for so long, and at a huge human cost, by the way. The cost has been enormous, but that rubs certain people the wrong way.
So talk about what's been happening. Who's in charge now? The last I read about it, it was Castro's brother was in charge for a long time, but who's in charge now?
So after Fidel stepped down and his brother Raúl Castro took over, who's also quite old now, in his 90s, when he then also stepped down, they nominated a non-Castro for the first time, a person called Miguel Díaz-Canel, who is now the president of Cuba, who is obviously a Communist Party member and has kind of come up the ranks, if you want. Most people who are Cuba watchers would probably agree that he doesn't have any real power. He is sort of the face, if you want,
of the party or
of the country, of the political apparatus. The real power in Cuba still is very much within the Castro family and within the military and within the Ministry of Interior. So these two ministries that are also economically quite well endowed. Most of the well-functioning businesses in Cuba, state businesses, are in the hands of the military and the Ministry of Interior. So that's where the real power lies. And Díaz-Canel is not seen as charismatic. He's not particularly well liked in Cuba in terms of the population, right now we're kind of, everybody's just waiting to see what happens with him on a sort of individual level.
So it's a communist socialist government economy that doesn't work very well for the people.
No, and it hasn't ever really worked for the people because it's basically been subsidized. It was subsidized for decades by the Soviet Union, and that's what kind of kept it alive economically. And for the first 2 decades, throughout the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, the Soviet Union and other former Eastern European countries that had this economic union called Comecon, if you might remember, they barter exchanged amongst each other, right? So Cuba, what did they have? Sugar. So they shipped sugar to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and in exchange, basically got everything else. And so this kept Cuba alive economically for decades. But when the Soviet Union fell apart, everybody thought Cuba would also fall like the next domino stone, and it didn't. It didn't politically, but it did economically. I mean, if you might remember, during the early 1990s, Cuba fell into a terrible economic crisis called the Special Period. There was no electricity, there was no food. A lot of people left, which is what led to, you mentioned the Mariel boat lift, which is in the 80s. In the 90s, there was this horrible raft crisis where, thousands of people just took to the sea, to the Florida Straits on whatever floated and tried to get to Florida. Largely, because they were hungry and were, destitute in terms of the economic and material situation on the island. Since then, the Cuban government has tried to, reinvent itself economically and invested heavily in tourism. It had one thing other than sugar, which was beautiful beaches and a lot of sunshine. And they got private investors from abroad to build hotels and banked on that as their form of getting a hard currency. The other thing that happened is that then Venezuela, also through Hugo Chavez, took on a socialist path. And those two nations, Cuba and Venezuela, became very close. And that's where Cuba got its oil, for the last 20 years until, of course, this January when Maduro was abducted by the US government. And since then, Cuba has had only one shipment of a Russian tanker's oil come in, and there's no oil coming in, and Cubans are literally living in darkness again for the second time in such an extreme way since the 1990s.
So they're living in darkness, and what are the other aspects of daily life? I mean,
right. So just to wind back a little bit, since the pandemic, Cuba has been in probably its worst economic crisis since the 1990s, maybe even ever, because with the pandemic, tourism fell apart. Oil shipments from Venezuela started becoming less because Venezuela was also in a crisis, economically speaking. And so one already felt, this economic crisis becoming worse and worse every day over the last 5 years. So there were already blackouts. Food prices were already increasing because of the lack of gas, etc. But since January, since literally, there's no more oil in Cuba, the lights have gone off. There are, on a good day, a couple of hours of electricity in Havana, in the capital, whilst in the provinces, most people live without electricity for days on end. This, of course, what does that mean? Without gas, there's no electricity, there is no transport, no public transport. You can't refrigerate your food because, of course, in that heat, in the tropical heat of Cuba, your food goes to waste within a day.
where do you pay? How do you pay for food?
Well, people are still employed mainly by the state. Some people work in now a small private sector that has been growing in the last couple of decades. But people are paying very, very high prices for, the food that exists, that is coming in from the countryside to the markets in the cities, but are living literally from day to day, making ends meet. There's high malnutrition in Cuba as a consequence now, mainly amongst the elderly and very young children. And most people, Sheryl, live on one meal a day. That's what's going on.
What happened to the medical industry? Because at one time, Cuba was supplying doctors to other, countries. Is that crashed as well?
It is crashing as we speak. So the medical healthcare system in Cuba has been suffering because of this general economic crisis for years now. There are no medicines. The medical staff has largely been disseminated because so many people have left the island. So one thing we haven't talked about yet is that in the last 5 years, about 2.5 million Cubans have left the island, have migrated outside. That's 25% of the population has left.
Where did they go?
So they mainly went first to Nicaragua, because they didn't need a visa for Nicaragua, and then they tried to go north to come to the U.S., and many made it, still under the Biden administration. Some people stayed in Central America or Mexico. Others went to Spain, or anywhere they could go.
Yeah.
But that's a lot of people, 25% of your population, and the people who have left mainly are between 18 and 45. So we're talking about, young people, professional people, well-educated people, and that has had a huge impact demographically, but also socially and economically on the island.
When I was in Cuba, probably around 2000, 2001, despite, difficult living conditions for a lot of people, although not as bad as now, Cubans would still, everyday Cubans would tell you that they still supported, very proud of the revolution and how it had changed their lives and their parents' lives. Do the Cuban people still support the communist government or the government that they have?
Look, it's very hard to say what most Cubans think because, of course, there are no real statistics in Cuba. We don't really know what Cubans think on a whole. But I would dare to guess, as somebody who knows Cuba well and does a lot of research there, particularly on these kinds of issues, that over the last 10 to 15 years, political support for the current government has fallen hugely in all, and this is important, all generations, because what we found still like 15 or 20 years ago when you were there is that mainly the elderly generation who had fought for the revolution and had seen its achievements were still supportive. There was loyalty.
Yeah.
But their children and their grandchildren were starting to, start questioning things. Now, in the last 10 to 15 years, Cuba economically has not done well. Things are now terrible. I mean, most people are living from day to day. And so people have started questioning the political system and the lack of freedom and also the economic model because most people are living in poverty now. And as a result, something very interesting has happened. That is that many young people, I was just in Cuba 6 weeks ago, and for the first time I heard particularly young people, say openly to me that they hoped that the US would invade.
I was about to ask you that.
Yeah, no, and I was shocked because I had never heard it. I mean, I had heard people, write it or say it sort of almost in private, but people are now saying this openly because they are so fed up with the status quo. And I'm talking about young people. And what does that say? That young people, particularly people who've been born after the Soviet Union fell, in this time of perpetual crisis, really, have come to a point where they have no more patience, right? They don't see any hope for the future, and they are willing to have change at any price. Whilst their parents are also sick and tired of the status quo, but say, not at any price. We still want our country to be treated as a sovereign country. And if we want change, we want it, because we negotiate with our own government, i.e., we want internal change, or that it's a negotiated change or peace agreement or some kind of economic and political agreement with the US, but no military intervention. So there you still see a generational difference between those who are saying change at any price and others who say not at the price of our own sovereignty.
For many years, people blamed the troubles of Cuba on the U.S. embargo. Mm-hmm. But there are other reasons, for the problems that Cuba's had that you
Yes.
touched on.
Yes.
What are they? What are the other reasons?
The U.S. embargo, for sure, has been a huge obstacle in Cuba's economic and social development and maintains that to this day. However, the Cuban government has used this as, a long-term excuse for all of its homegrown problems. It has to be said that, Cuba can import goods from most other countries. It also imports food and medicine from the US, which is sort of often not something known, that despite the embargo, the Cuban government can import food and medicine from the US. But the Cuban government, the communist system, I think as a whole, we've seen this in many other countries, has suffered in the past in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union from massive problems of mismanagement, economic, social mismanagement, of corruption, of lack of stimulus. Most workers don't feel stimulated.
So you can't produce good products.
Right. And so that is part of the problem. And so all of this comes together in kind of a perfect storm. And right now, the Cuba that I've lived in recently it has sort of the worst of the communist system and the worst of the capitalist system together.
Right.
It's the worst of the worst.
Right. And then, as you alluded to, you have the upper levels, people at the upper levels of the Communist Party who are doing pretty well, but it's just not trickling down to.
Right. So now Cuba really is a society that that most people don't know if they haven't been to Cuba, which is, Cuba was so well known for many decades in the early decades as having, achieved a certain level of equality between, its citizens, and that was, based on free education and free healthcare and housing and employment for all and all these kinds of things. But since the crisis in the 90s, social inequality has grown immensely, and there is poverty in Cuba, even extreme poverty. I mean, again, we don't have statistics, but conservative estimates by experts, both in Cuba and outside of Cuba, who work on these issues, we believe that about 40% of the population in Cuba lives in extreme poverty. and that's probably a conservative estimate, and lives on one poor meal a day. And it should also be said, and this is very important, is that most people today living in poverty are people of African descent. This is something that's also very much overlooked in Cuba, the issue of race.
Right.
So unfortunately, the achievements that were made in the early decades of the revolution, which helped a lot of people of African descent really be able to gain education and go to university, et cetera, and become professionals, has really changed in the last 20 to 25 years. And we're seeing much of the same economic, but also social and racial stratification come back that was existent in pre-revolutionary years.
Is it getting it? Who is lobbying on behalf of Cuba? Does Cuba get any kind of foreign support from anywhere?
At the moment, no. I mean, until recently, Venezuela obviously was a close ally. That has abruptly changed since the end of January, early February. The Chinese, the Russians are, I would say, giving mainly verbal support, but in terms of what the Cuban government needs real support in terms of economic and material support, right now there's nothing coming in.
Is there anything hopeful going on inside of Cuba that you see?
Look, the reality of Cuba right now is that most people are living in a humanitarian crisis, and that is becoming more complex as the days go by. As long as we don't know in what direction the U.S. goes in terms of whether it's going to invade or intervene in Cuba militarily, or let it just fall like a sort of house of cards, or actually keep on negotiating with the government, the Cuban people are suffering tremendously. I mean, people are going hungry, people are dying. Imagine being in a situation where there's no electricity and you become sick, or you're an elderly person and you fall and you can't get to a hospital because there's no public transport, there's no ambulances, nothing is working. So a lot of people are now dying from things they would have not been dying or died from just even months ago. So this is the kind of extreme situation we're in right now. So the situation on the ground is really, really dismal, catastrophic, I would say. I think if there's anything positive to be said about Cuba right now, is that more and more people are connected to the world through social media, through their families and friends abroad, and are much, much more in touch with the news, with what's going on in the world, and can have much more information in terms of how to think critically about their own society and reality. So you will see people very well informed now, which they weren't even 10 to 15 years ago. And I think that's a very positive improvement, because they can critically think much more about their own lives and express themselves much more eloquently about their critique of their own society and system.
What could you see happening that could turn around this humanitarian crisis and this political crisis? What would need to happen?
In terms of the humanitarian crisis, I think what really needs to happen is a initiative coming from the international community, mainly actors like Canada, Europe, Latin America, to help Cuba in terms of real humanitarian aid, food, medicines, and oil, so that it can be distributed on the island. Right now, the Catholic Church on the island and a few other actors are trying their best to get aid to certain groups of people, but it's a drop on the hot stone. A much more cooperative effort on the part of many actors needs to happen as we speak. But that's just going to sort of maybe not solve, but alleviate the humanitarian crisis. What needs to happen sooner than later is a real negotiated agreement between Cuba and the United States, supported by international actors. There is so much distrust between the Cuban government and the US government that I personally see it as very, very difficult that the US and the Cuban government can just negotiate an agreement on their own. I think what really needs to happen is that actors like maybe the Vatican and other trusted actors, international actors from both sides, trusted by the US and Cuba, need to support an effort of dialogue to come to some resolution, political resolution, that can get us out of this current impasse. Because as every day goes by, Sheryl, people literally are dying in Cuba for no good reason, because we're in a limbo. And I think that as long as the focus is on the Middle East right now, in Iran, Cuba is waiting to see what happens, and that is having a huge humanitarian consequence.
Cuba used to be known for, I guess, fruit, sugar,
Coffee, tobacco.
Does it produce any of those anymore?
Very little, because of the lack of gasoline, which also, there's no more tractors in Cuba. I mean, the whole agricultural sector has pretty much also broken down. But now the situation is so bad that Cuba, until recently, was importing sugar from Vietnam, imagine. There is still some production of tobacco, a little bit of coffee, but not to the levels it could and should. But Cuba has so much potential. It could be self-sufficient in terms of food and other goods, and it is, as we speak, and for a long time hasn't been producing much. It has been mainly importing its food, even, partly because of the mismanagement by the government. So I am hopeful for the future, because Cuba has enormous potential in terms of its, it's very fruitful. It has an amazing, people that is incredibly entrepreneurial. Most of them are well educated. So there's a lot to look forward to.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we're stuck.
It's been on the wrong side of a bad deal. Yeah. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Katrin Hansing, Professor of Anthropology at Baruch College, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Instagram at 1-to-1 CUNY TV. And you can watch the show on the go by downloading the CUNY TV app. For 1-to-1 and CUNY TV, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.